Wonderful. We are live. So this is Pietro Paganini, and today we're running our Austrian Economics Monthly. And here we come with the topic. I have to say I have a conflict of interest because it's a topic I'm really challenged by and I really follow very much. And we have three wonderful guests that I'm very delighted to have joining us. One is Daniel Kedic that already been with us in the past, at least before summer. Daniel, correct me if I'm wrong.
Absolutely.
And then we have Mario Fantini, and then we have also Graham Watson. Before going to them and allow them to speak, question is why we chose this topic that for somebody it's just something annoying, for somebody it's very controversial, for many others is very challenging. Well, let me start by saying that President Putin, some weeks before the pandemic said, or the pandemic started, said, liberal democracy is ended or has failed its objective. And a few months earlier, President Trump, and that was the leitmotif for the entire campaign of President Trump, was we have, or I won because I have addressed the needs of what he called the forgotten. And it seems that as liberals or as wider liberal family, in a way, we have failed to address some of the challenges, the contemporary challenges and the issues that come with globalization, the issues that come with a technological change. So the initial question that we can start with today is whether there is actually a crisis in our liberal democracies, and if liberalism as a core of contemporary democracy has failed to achieve some of its objectives. And I cannot forget that it was approximately 20 years ago. That shows that I'm old. Graham, don't worry, because that was around 20 years ago, and I was the vice president of the European Liberal Youth, and Graham was leading the European Liberal Democrats movement or party inside the European Parliament. And Graham said something that I always kept with me. Liberalism is a methodology. And so therefore crisis should be a part of this methodology as a way to change what we are facing and what we are challenged by. So when we talk about crisis in a liberal democracy, should be something, I would say, and I know this is hard to understand, but something that we should be welcome. But the fact is that people are actually turning away from democracies. They think that democracies have failed to address their needs and to address their will, and therefore they are looking into more or into quicker decision-making processes, and therefore dictatorship, what we could define as populism, or what we could define as the solo man on power that can take faster decision. That's why, and not many years ago from now, President Putin was somehow the leader of the world, according to some people. That's why the Communist Party in China has been approached by some Europeans as the future of democracy, or capitalist democracy, or as you want to call it. But let me go to my guest, otherwise it becomes my show, and it's not my show. I'm just a moderator, but I wanted to introduce this. And I'm sure that the three wonderful speakers we have with us are familiar with this topic, and they're probably thinking, well, probably, people feel alone. People felt that our system are not really addressing their needs, that the technological change did not make them richer, although in a way they are, but it made them poor, that the flexibility in the labor market has not improved their working condition, and that globalization has not given them so many chances. And they, of course, go against what they see as the evil, like the European Union on one side, the establishment that is in Brussels or in New York, the financial establishment, the deep media, and so on. And we also live in a time of fake news where science, in a way, has been put aside. And as liberals, as a methodology, we believe firmly in science, but we perceive that right now it's very hard to use scientific arguments with people and with the audience. And there are news, if we think about the pandemic or if we think about many other topics, where people choose the fake news, choose the prejudice, choose the bias instead of the evidences that science is bringing to us. So I will start with Daniel. Daniel is the general director at the European Liberal Foundation. So probably is the one that has in Europe right now, when we talk about liberalism, one of the best monitoring position or overlooking position. Daniel, is liberal democracies in a crisis or not?
Oh, absolutely. Western liberal democracies are going through a deep crisis, but let's face it, everyone is going through a deep crisis at the moment, as we are all confined to our own homes at the moment through COVID, through the economic consequences both of the lockdowns and of the pandemic. But liberal democracies have been rather resilient over the last decades. And what I would actually rather see is that we became a victim of our own success. It has been gotten so much better that we don't remember how bad it used to be in the past. I am German, and I had a family, or still have family, on both sides of what was back then the Iron Curtain, so in East and in West Germany. And I grew up in the land of plenty. I never knew hunger, I never knew any problems that I only got in touch with after, at the beginning of the 1990s, seeing how my relatives in the former GDR lived, which was a completely different life. Moving later to former socialist countries, I actually saw how much better it had gotten over the years. But this is something that a lot of people have forgotten or have chosen to forget. Moreover, we have been on this so successful trajectory that everything, this betterment, this feeling of things getting better, and this integration of liberal democracies has been seen as a natural sequence of events and happenings. It was always saying, if this happens, that will happen. This was also one of the fallacies when it came to the European integration, by the way, saying this is a natural chain of events. No, it's not. And as soon as bumps in the road appear, meaning that if people see it differently or if we see a challenge, then indeed we start stumbling. And we have underestimated our enemies. You have mentioned Putin. And while we have this neo-liberal institutionalist consensus of we want to collaborate in Europe, there are people around us who don't see it that way, who don't want us to succeed, and who don't want to collaborate. And at the same time, we had our own issues that we have plastered over with money to a large extent. We have been looking the other way and ignoring problems that we should have taken up, especially when it comes to the social welfare systems and parts of the economy. We have taken too much and too many things for granted, and we have underestimated the appeal of a free lunch. And taking all that together with something that you already addressed, and that is something I would call the Instagramification of information. And it's not about discussion anymore. It's not about finding evidence, having an evidence-based discourse being true. No, it's getting out the picture the quickest, and then everybody else has to debunk what you have just been saying. At the same time, we're talking about the quick solution, the quick fixes, like for Fridays for Future or other movements that want to operate outside of the democratic process to quick fix problems that they perceive are there. So how do we get out of that? And we have been horribly bad as liberals communicating what are the benefits. And we cannot just be like the socialists and the others and say, hey, I will promise you milk and honey will flow. No, we have to say how it is, that is actual work. But we are there in a bidding war with the other, with the socialists, with a lot of conservatives who promise milk and honey to people. So why we try to find ourselves, we are being torn apart between the socialists and the conservatives. But liberals actually have something to show for. They can show that things have gotten better, but we have to be better at explaining things. And that this works is something that you have seen in the financial and economic crisis in Estonia, where the liberal government came forward and said, okay, people, we have a problem. These are the steps we have to undertake because we want to reach the following results. Treat citizens as grown-ups, as equals, don't rule them, govern a country, manage a country, and then things go better. And last but not least, I would like to recall the great European liberal Ralph Dahrendorf, who in the year of 1997 wrote an essay in German. It's called Globalization and the Social Consequences, where he has been predicting the same situation that we have here right now. The success of liberal democracy, the success of trade, of economic opening of countries, that is chances and prosperity for millions. But also a retreat in ever more closed communities, because all this new information around us, all these new opportunities also make people afraid. And then there are those people, being it nationalist, religious, or other societal leader, who exploit these sentiments. And this is something that is extremely dangerous. And this is something where liberals need to find an answer with the success that we have had over the years. And we should not be shy to fight for it, because unfortunately, shyness, talking about our success, seems to be something very inherently liberal.
Thank you so much, Daniel. As usual, you brought in so many arguments. Let me, before moving to Graham Watson, let me just remind you that we are live on Facebook, but on Facebook, you cannot ask questions, or you can, but obviously we can't answer them because we are not reading them, or I'm not reading them, and don't ask me to read them because I can't read them. But you can definitely ask questions through the question and answer section or through the chat. We are being recorded, so this event will be available forever, at least till the internet exists. And some of these videos, well, of course, a part of the video will be circulated later on. Graham, Daniel brought, as usual, a lot of arguments to the table. I love the Instagramification. That's a word I never heard. Now I'm definitely going to use it. But he said things were going very well, and we were probably too arrogant, let me translate that, to not seeing that something was changing. But he also said something to me very important, that we are, or we have been, but we are probably not capable of explaining the good results that have been achieved. Do you think, Graham, that this is exclusively the problem, or there is something more behind?
Well, could I say, first of all, Pietro, what a pleasure it is to be with you, and congratulations to Martin Gundinger for getting us together to talk about what I think is a very important issue. And it's always a pleasure to be with people who have chosen among our audience to stay curious and to stay optimistic. I was interested to hear what Daniel had to say, and I agree with a lot of it, but I'm not sure that I agree that it's fundamentally a problem of communication. I think it goes maybe a wee bit deeper than that, Daniel. I mean, my analysis of where we are at the moment goes back to the end of the Cold War, the end of the 1980s, when we had a peace dividend that we could have invested in a new social contract. We failed to do that. We allowed ourselves to be carried along on a tide of belief that this was somehow the end of ideology, the triumph of capitalism, or whatever. And we went into a 20-year splurge, a 20-year orgy, if you like, of consumption and leverage and speculation. And in 2008, we got the financial reckoning of that. And what we're now having is the geopolitical hangover from that party. You know, the social compact as it existed in the 20th century has broken down. It's broken down both within societies and across borders. We have a global market, but we don't have a global social contract. We have not recreated it. Moreover, we are losing the capacity to fix the problem, partly because we don't really live in a global community. We live in a series of Chinese hutongs, a series of gated communities within a global village, where we're not talking to people whose experience is different from our own. It's partly because we've moved from what was once called bowling alone to global chat rooms where we're talking to people who think the same way as we do and not to others. And it's partly because there's been a lack of leadership. And as a result, we have lost the 5 elements of trust. Break that down. Trust, T-R-U-S-T, truth, responsibility, understanding, sympathy, and transparency. you talked about Trump having mentioned, the forgotten, having appealed to the forgotten. I think in a sense he has, because the weakest link in Western capitalism is the inattention to the moral and ethical basis of it. Mencius, the Chinese philosopher, Meng Tzu, as the Chinese would call him, said that to build a state, you have to begin with the heart. And I think it's too easy for many people to worry about the end of the world when a lot of others are worrying about the end of the month. It's too easy for a global citizen to become a citizen of nowhere rather than to be a citizen of everywhere, recognizing the responsibilities of a global citizen everywhere. The inequality of wealth and income has led to a fundamental crisis of liberal democracy. Now, I'm not ignoring other crises around it. I'm not ignoring the environmental imperative. I'm not ignoring the murderous clash of the three Abrahamic religions, or the discrimination on the basis of gender or color or creed or whatever. I'm not ignoring the dangerous sacrifice of data in an age where data privacy has become a serious issue. But I think a liberal has to start on the basis of being neither enthralled by the market nor enamored by the state, of being constantly on guard against the abuse of power. And we are seeing abuses of power. So we need in society a discussion of where sovereignty lies in the 21st century, and where the fundamental challenges are no longer national or even regional, but global. We need a discussion of how we reestablish the ability of society to control outcomes, to control the aggregate outcomes of individual choices, and to respond to the needs of people. Now, perhaps coronavirus and the rapid change in thinking that has engendered offers us an opportunity to do that, perhaps. But I think it was Einstein who said that the only things that are infinite are the universe and man's stupidity. And then he added that he wasn't sure about the universe.
Thank you, Graham. And apologize if I have not really introduced you, but the problem is that I know you so well that I forget to introduce you. So Graham Watson has been, was a member of the parliament and the leader of the European Liberal and Democrats, and actually the man that transit the European Liberal and Democrats and reformists from the LDR into the European Liberal and Democrats Alliance, or at least in that period of time. Graham, and the last time I met, actually in the panel, is the last person I met in the island of Ventotene in June or July was. And I was diving, and Graham was doing wonderful sailing throughout the Mediterranean. And luckily, you came back safe. But Graham, you mentioned many aspects, but it seems that one element that at least I capture in your statements is that their citizens have lost power in a way. The liberals want to empower citizens, but in a way we did not empower them. So in this debate where we have a representative of the European Liberal Foundation, we have the former member of European Parliament and leader of the European Liberal and Democrats, I wanted to call it conservative, that in a way define themselves as a liberal, or at least in the libertarian larger family. That is Mario Fantini, who was the chief editor of a magazine that's called Conservative. So Mario, Daniel and Graham has brought this argument to the table. Do you agree? And I'm sure you do, but you are providing a different answer. And I want to remind that you were in Rome, and you mentioned it earlier before we got online, to a very controversial, as you call it, conservative meeting. And probably when we talk about sovereignty, you have a different idea of that than as liberals we might have.
Thank you, Pietro, and thank you to the panelists and all my friends out there. I'd like to put aside that Rome conference that you just referred to, because I think we're getting off track. We're each raising so many issues that I think we do a disservice to our audience if we didn't refocus things on what the core question was here about the crisis of liberal democracy. And it is complicated, like most things in life. It's complicated, and there are nuances. And the first thing that we should, if we had the time, discuss is what exactly do we mean by liberal democracy? And that could take up hours, right? That's a fascinating discussion, and it's really worth having. And maybe at the end we could do that. What I'd like to do is describe the two perspectives from which I approach the question is of whether or not there is a crisis of liberal democracy. On the one hand, I don't think there is a crisis of the kind that people like Anne Applebaum or former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, or even The Economist magazine talk about and warn about. They've all pointed to the US as a flawed democracy, or that Western democracies are on the verge of collapse. They've warned us about the rise of illiberal democracy and fascism that's just around the corner. I don't think I know I don't share any of those feelings or thoughts, nor, I should add, do I think or share the ideas and opinions of a classical liberal thinker like Karen Horn, who has at a Mont Pelerin Society meeting warned about the dangers of populism, very alarmist language. On the other hand, I do think that, particularly if we turn to people like Richard Legutko, and I have a stack of books here, this is a fascinating topic for me, but if we turn to people like Richard Legutko, the Polish MEP, or Patrick Deneen at the University of Notre Dame, or even Adrian Pabst, I think there is a crisis. Each of these scholars and many others have identified features and characteristics and hallmarks such as the erosion of individual freedom in Western liberal democracies, the growth of powerful and massive bureaucracies, the rise of big tech monopolies, and general oligarchic trends that have left so many working people around the world disenfranchised, alienated, and marginalized. And for a moment, let me just focus on Adrian Pabst, who's fascinating. His analysis is particularly compelling because he's not a conservative. And yet he's coming to similar conclusions that conservative scholars have arrived at in previous years. Adrian Pabst says basically that even though he's a committed liberal Democrat, he is worried and concerned about how it's been developing over the past several decades. He sees liberal democracies as increasingly intolerant about the values of ordinary working people, while at the same time concentrating increasingly wealth and power into the hands of a little elite, of unaccountable elites, I think he calls them. It's the same thing that other people have called cognitive elites. Charles Murray famously called them the overclass, very sinister sounding. But anyway, that is the crisis within the Western liberal democracies that we should be talking about. Why is this crisis arising? What has failed among these liberal democracies? And how can we respond? And one final comment, returning to these warnings about populism, of course, it depends on whether or not we're talking about right-wing or left-wing populism. But really, in general, if I may be so bold, I think the rise and emergence of populism around the world is exciting and invigorating. In fact, it reflects the reinvigoration of the political process, and people, that is, voters, are finally standing up, going out into the streets in some cases, and yelling, basta, enough. And they're reclaiming or trying to reclaim what has been taken away from them, I would say. They're pushing back against these bureaucracies, whether they're state bureaucracies or large bureaucracies from the private sector, and they're trying to reassert their individual liberty and freedom. And I think liberals and conservatives both should rally around this kind of emergence, this phenomenon around the world.
Thank you, Mario. Thanks also for mentioning all these authors. And again, I want to also thank Daniel before for mentioning Dahrendorf. And actually, I want to stress that Dahrendorf, in a way, 20 and more than 20 years ago, 30 years ago, as somehow anticipated what would have been a possible or potential crisis of the European Union as to turn into such a bureaucracy as Mario was saying here. Daniel, I'm coming back to you also because you guys are perfectly on time, and I can see that Cram is not as Italian as he wants to show, and he has been perfectly on time, but all of you have been. Daniel, do you agree with what, in a way, as anticipated by Graham, but also by Mario, that there's been a failure in the system, and we, in a way, liberal democracy as well, went back to a sort of pre-medieval society where some people got too much power and some other people lost this power, when we talk about empowering citizens, where there are this over bureaucracy, we call them now the deep media. Do you see this, or you think that Mario is too much on the conservative side and see an enemy that actually is not there? But if I look at Brussels, and Graham would apologize me, I have the feeling that sometimes there is such a bureaucracy that in a way is forgetting about European citizens.
Well, there's certainly, and also that's something I mentioned in my intervention, a certain detachment from reality every once in a while. That is something I could especially observe when we were talking about European solutions to climate change and other issues. When I was talking to Nordics about potential solutions, that we're talking about electrification, interconnected grids, electric cars for everyone, and me just coming from 6.5 years living in Bulgaria, the biggest market for third and fourth hand cars in Europe, we're asking, so how are these people going to pay for that? So there's a certain detachment from reality, not only in the bureaucracy, but also within Europe. There are different realities that we have to take into account. At the same time, I would like to get back to a very important question. When was ever a time where civil society had more to say? When was ever a time when the individual citizen had more to say, could be heard more? So there's this bashing on these big bureaucracies. I find that sometimes a bit of a strawman argument. I have to admit that deflects from the real problem. I have to agree to one aspect, both with Mario and with Graham. It is not the problem of the capitalist society that we saw the big financial economic and financial crisis. It was a crisis of the states that had malincentives that they created, that they were getting into sovereign debt and therefore created problems. And then also when it comes to the communication aspect of it, yes, I find that it's important, but also something that you could hear from my intervention. It's not the only thing. You have to, as liberals, you have to stay brave and bold for what you believe in, what we have achieved, what we want to achieve, but you have to know what we want to achieve, and these then are the policies. So coming back to the initial question, no, I don't think that we have this big over bureaucracy in a lot of places, but we have malincentives that are created by those bureaucracies. We have bureaucracies that have lost touch with the citizens and with the problems that these citizens have every once in a while. We have, as I said, lost touch with reality, how people perceive it to a large extent. And that is something that I find the real dangerous problem. And I think Mario would probably agree with me on that. That is also something that we've seen in the political discussion over years and years. And that is also something that I attribute to the rise of certain what we call populist forces and more extremist forces in Europe, by the way. If you tell people that disagree with you because you are not able to have an evidence-based discussion anymore, that they are socialists, that they are Nazis or similar, they will say at a certain point, maybe you're right, maybe that's who I am. So you're pushing them into a certain area in the end of the day that they never wanted to be in. So once again, I think that could have been avoided with standing brave and bold where we what we stand for as liberals, but it's also something taking into account what I like to call reality every once in a while and checking our actions against that, and not only being in this bubble that we are creating around ourselves. And I'm not only talking about the bureaucracy, I'm also talking about that, what we have around ourselves. And that is the social bubble and the social echo chamber that we are creating around ourselves, where the Trumpists are talking to the Trumpists and the Bidenists are talking to the Bidenists, and then they talk about each other and have a certain preconception about each other that, again, for a large part, doesn't have to do anything with reality.
Thank you. So, Daniel, it seems that, and I'm turning to Graham here, it seems that critical thinking that is the core of liberalism is somehow disappearing, or probably using Daniel's expression, we actually have improved a lot our critical thinking. The problem is that the complexity around us is much bigger. But Graham, in a way, you have been, as Daniel in a way is too, but you have been part of that bubble as member of the European Parliament, as a long-standing member of the European Parliament, leader of the Liberals. Question one is there really a bubble, a deep state that has forgotten about people? And then when Daniel is talking about what we want to achieve as liberals, what are we looking for? And that's a big question, I know. You don't have 30 minutes to answer, you have a few minutes.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure there's, I wouldn't argue that there is a deep state that is controlling things. That is an argument that can be used in certain countries at certain times. I don't think that's what's happening at global level. I think we have lost control of global capitalism in certain respects. I mentioned the issue of data privacy. I think one of the most urgent things to do at the moment is to regulate the behavior of some of the tech companies who are mining people's data, while people think that they are mining the data of the companies themselves are holding. I don't think that we as liberals have perhaps been at the forefront of formulating the ideas of crisis. Mario was talking about the work of Adrian Pabst on the right. You can look at Adrian Pabst, or you can look from him to Thomas Piketty. There is a consensus on either side that a crisis exists. I happen to share that view, and I happen to think that it is being expressed in different ways. It's being expressed in fundamentalism, whether it is voters or indeed individuals choosing fundamental nationalism or religious fundamentalism. It's being expressed in the way that capitalism is not working. Capitalism has to work on the premise that if you work hard, you can improve yourself and your family. And yet it is impossible, or very near impossible, to get from poorer countries into wealthier countries at the moment because of government action to prevent migration. The market is not working. There is not the response to the stimulus. And therefore, I think liberals must recognize this. And if we want to be at the forefront of putting solutions, then we need to engage in what we do best, which is social dialogue, talking to people of both sides, of all sides, and bringing them together to form a consensus about a way forward.
Thank you, Graham. And certainly what we're trying to do here today in a few minutes, of course, is trying to make this social dialogue, or as I like to call with our Austrian friend, is a social or individual conflict, because it's through the conflict of ideas that we can generate, hopefully, a better knowledge. And I'm very happy there's some common friends that have joined us today, at least in the audience. And again, if you have any question or comments, as Christoph Ledel has done on the chat, or feel free to post question over the question and answer area, or of course you can contact our friends here in the panel through their emails or their Twitter account. Mario, I'm coming back to you, and then we close with another round of questions, because we have been very quick. It seems we're getting a TV talk show, and probably I should be promoted by Barbara Colm as the anchorman now, and obviously get a little, since we're all liberals and believe in free market, little check as usual. Mario, here we got the liberal perspective, and Graham talked about a social dialogue. Do you think that is enough? Because you define yourself as a conservative. I know you have liberal roots, but you like to define yourself as conservative. What is the difference between liberalism and conservative in few words, of course? And do you think the social dialogue is the starting point?
Well, that's a bit problematic because while I do like the word conservative, it's not the only word I've ever used to describe myself. I am at various times a classical liberal, a traditionalist, sometimes even a reactionary. It all depends. And one of the reasons that we use the title European Conservative for the magazine is to provoke. And you might have seen that in the past we have published all sorts of people from the center right, never Marxists, by the way, but always different thinkers, classical liberals, libertarians, even the occasional monarchist. They are out there. To respond to your question, it's not a hard and fast thing. And as Graham just mentioned, the people on different sides or different parts of the political spectrum are coming together and diagnosing or recognizing the same problem. And it's not just the failure of the market or capitalism, it's also the failure of the state, whether you like or prefer a big state or a reduced small state. There is something happening that I'm happy to say a lot of us are recognizing, right and left. The problem is, or the challenge is, how do we respond and what policy proposals do we have? And unfortunately, those who are most entrenched in the so-called system, the lifelong career politicians of Washington, and pardon me, Sir Graham, I don't include you in this group, but a lot of those people don't recognize that there's a crisis, or if they do recognize that there's a crisis, they find it or on the right. They say it's just the extremists on the right, and they never focus on the extremists of the left, which are part of the problem in the US at the very least. I think going forward, if we can have this social dialogue, these conversations increasingly with people from across the aisle, so to speak, I think that would do a lot. And if we can come around and agree on some fundamental values and principles, we might find a way out of the current crisis. I'm reminded often of something that Mark Lilla, definitely not a conservative, has said. There can be no liberal politics without a sense of we. Similar to what Adrian Paps said, similar to what Sir Graham just said. We need to rediscover what it is that we have in common, what it is that makes us part of a community. And I think if we can do that, then there is hope. Sometimes I lose that hope, I will admit, but if we can do that, we have a future.
Thank you so much, Mario. As liberals, we shouldn't follow very much hope. We shouldn't follow more facts, but that's of course a provocation. Barbara here in the chat says it was a mean question. I don't know whether it was a mean question to you or a mean question asking for a check. Probably the second one, asking for a check. Daniel, I'm coming back for one last question. Of course, feel free then to jump in for further comments. Mario said something to me intriguing, because when we talk about the European Union as well, that's coming to mind. He says the failure of the state. But one of the things that we seem to ignore in Europe, all of us, is that the state as we know it is a liberal invention. Let me say that. It's not the state as it is intended in socialism or communism or social democracy, but the state in England was created to govern as the rule of law, to govern and to allow people to live together in freedom and prosperity. With Brussels growing, or at least now in the pandemic, do you see the failure of the state? And is the state part of the problem? That goes, and sorry, Daniel, I'm just adding this, coming from a country where there is, I would say, a lifelong problem, but I also see a problem of institution within the states. The fact that parliaments, I would say all around Europe, probably all around the world, are having troubles in addressing rapidly, as people would like, some of the problems that citizens are facing as well.
Well, I think we have to take a step back there. Yes, in a lot of liberal understanding today, this is the state. But we don't come from an American tradition where the role of the state is to ensure life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We come from a long-standing tradition of states, and that includes the absolute tradition in some states. In some parts, especially when you look at the bureaucracy, that system has still prevailed. I'm by birth, I'm a Prussian. We invented the modern democracy, bureaucracy in Western Europe to a large extent. And this was not to serve the people. It was to serve the king. It was in order so the king could rule the country, or the emperor could rule the country. It was not for the people. And that is something that you very often still see in the self-understanding of a lot of politicians, not liberal politicians, and people who are in part in this bureaucracy. And I'll give you a very simple example. I currently live in Belgium, like Graham as well. The Belgian state thinks that it's okay to take 70% of my income and take it away. Because. So this is not because the state wants to serve me and puts me as an individual and my life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness in the center. There must be something else. And so therefore I have to reject that premise to a certain degree. And the question is then how we get out of this conundrum. And therefore we need to be talking about reform. We need to be talking about reclaiming the sovereignty of the individual in the entire process. And that is unfortunately not possible like Fridays for Future or other organizations would like that we can just do it, but we have to take the forum that we have, and that is the democratic process, in order to bring it to the forefront. But then again, as we have been talking about communication, Graham, in the end of the day, we agreed to that this is necessary, and bring our ideas forward and not resort to something that I would call neo-tribalism, where we have this outsourcing of all the bad things that we can imagine in life and put it in Biden, put it in Trump, or whoever we have in front of us to make this person, this group, this belief, the enemy. And we have to go back to something indeed. We were talking about Dahrendorf earlier today. We have to identify that conflict is something normal in societies, and discussion and debate and conflict is something not only deeply human, it's something deeply necessary for a society. And coming to solutions through debate, through fight, through conflict, positive conflict, is the only way to go around it. But then again, we have the survival instinct of certain institutions, especially of bureaucracies, and Barbara Korn probably in the audience will appreciate that. There is nothing so permanent like a temporary government program. So we have to fight these notions of survival of these bureaucracies and replace them with something that indeed serves the citizens and not itself the bureaucracy, and go away from this classic thinking of governing and ruling, but rather serving the sovereign, who is the people.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Graham, I'm coming to you for a last question. And again, if there is any question from the audience, please put it forward, and I'm sure our panel is happy to answer, and we can take a few minutes more. Daniel talked about, and I agree with this, with the fact that we need to address this conflict. He also talked about reforming and the fact that we need to go through reforms. But as President Luigi Einaudi, like 70 years ago, was used to say, and that's something I will always carry with me, and I often write about it, all of this takes time and it requires work. And Einaudi was, there was no internet back then, not social media. Einaudi was used to say, what we can do is work hard every day to solve one by one each problem. But now people want to have answers in a matter of a second. Do we have this time? And if somebody from the people that forgotten is probably listening to us right now says, oh my God, this is nonsense, we want answer. Are we able to address this question? Or are we able to convince people that in a wide and huge complexity, it takes hard work, time, and, patience?
Well, I think, Pietro, Einaudi was right. It does take time. And one of the difficulties with the consumer society that we've built is that people have moved from being citizens, fundamentally, to being consumers, fundamentally. They no longer, we have robbed ourselves of the opportunity to control aggregate outcomes of individual choices. And the consumer expects immediate satisfaction from politics or from government in the same way as they expect immediate satisfaction from the market. And that's where I think civic education is actually hugely important. Now, Daniel mentioned, high tax rates in Belgium. Belgium has a liberal government. Denmark has a liberal government, has very high tax rates. I'm not sure I would defend the rates of tax. But what I would say is that both of those societies have been very successful in creating what Ralph Dahrendorf called life chances. More successful, I think, than the Anglo-Saxon approach. Mario talked about the need to move from I to we. I remember hearing a sociologist saying that if you take the I out of illness and replace it with a we, you get wellness. And I think there is a certain amount of wellness that is needed in Anglo-Saxon societies that is currently missing. For me, coming from Scotland, my thinking on economic liberalism goes back to Adam Smith. And I will never forget that before he wrote his book, The Wealth of Nations, he wrote a work called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And he basically pointed out that capitalism takes no prisoners. It destroys competition wherever it can. You need the intervention of the state to regulate. And I think if we go back to Adam Smith, then we can start again to think about how we are organizing our society. Back to basics.
Thank you so much, Graham, for reminding us of Smith, but also for reminding us that you're Scottish. We forgot about that. Mario, I want to end with you, unless there are other questions here. Again, you define yourself conservative. You said there's many other ways to defining yourself.
I am large, I contain multitudes, to quote Walt Whitman.
Multitude, yes. But do you think that we have the time that we can go through this critical thinking, that we can convince people that takes time, takes patience, and takes hard work?
That's a very good question. And unfortunately, I'm often discouraged because all that requires, as you said, time, but also effort. And Graham just mentioned civic education. It requires people to read books. People don't read anymore. We live in such a hyperactive society, and everyone's is ensconced in their digital toy that I often wonder if the future of democracies, whether liberal or illiberal, have a future, how they're going to fare. I know we're running out of time, but I just want to end with the following statement. Yes, I believe that we have to reassert the sovereignty of the individual. And at the same time, we have to reassert or rebuild the sovereignty of the nation state. This gets back to your first question to me about that Rome conference, where there a lot of sovereigntists were there, so-called. But to do that, we really have to allow for disruptive elements to flow, to emerge, as Daniel mentioned. We need to be comfortable with chaos, with a little disturbance here and there. And this reminds me of what a friend told me recently. He said, Mario, the future of conservatism is revolutionary. And I think there's much to that. Because what I see when I look around, I don't see an Athenian agora, and I don't see a Swiss town square. I see bureaucracies and organizations, oligarchies, and the administrative state. And I think we need to fight together, liberals, conservatives, libertarians, against this and push back.
Thank you so much, Mario, for this closing statement. Unless, Graham, you have anything to add, or Daniel, please. There is one comment that I see. Let me see if it's a question that we can address. Gentlemen, thank you very. This is a greeting. But Mario, you talk about something revolutionary. As liberals, we should not believe in revolutions. And here I may mention Karl Popper, but at least we did a little revolution here with the Austrian Economics and with competitor in Italy, because we started this series of events back in March, and we're still here. We still have a pandemic, and that's probably a challenge or an issue we should address in this day, that we still have the virus around us, and we're still probably going into a new lockdown all around Europe, and that's probably talking about our freedom. But I think we did a good job, and we're trying to do a good job, and I want to thank the Austrian Economics Center, Martin, Brit and Victoria, and particularly, of course, Barbara, for putting us together. My team here in Rome, Giacomo and Stefano, for always being present, and everybody that has joined. I saw that there were several people joining in and out, and some Italian friends, some people from Chile, and in Chile they got a referendum, and my friend Natalia, that is here, was very depressed because they lost, or she lost as a liberal, the referendum, but she knows that's just the beginning for a conflict, and I think we should go on discussing and, you know, proposing alternative solution. And if we fail, it's just part of, you know, the way we should do as liberal. Thank you, Daniel, for being here with us from Brussels. Thank you, Graham, very much for being here. Hopefully, I'll see you very soon in Ventotene and sailing. And thank you, Mario. That I know you're locked in Austria and you just want to run away. And in a way, I don't blame you, although it's a beautiful country. Thank you, everybody. The event is being recorded, and we were live on Facebook. So thank you very much, and see you soon, or at least next month with another event. Ciao.
Thank you. Ciao. Thank you.